Hello, and welcome to our third episode of Black Women Matter Wednesday. Our topic today is about Black women and the church. I was reading an article the other day out of Christianity Today, and it stated that the Black church is comprised of 70 to 90% of Black women. 70
Wow.
to 90%. That's a whole lot of women. Paula, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, when I think about Black women in the church and just my memories, it makes so much sense. I can just see in my mind's eye my grandmother, my aunties leading the choirs, singing in the church, preparing food, taking care of the children, having the children's stories and making sure they have all the little things in their little baskets, the little activities, and just really the organization, usually like the church secretary, who the church usually like depends so heavily on, the people who are running the church, actually the clerk, the secretary, just so many pieces, so many facets of our church. And I see Black women having those roles.
Mhm. You know, when I think about that as well, as far as Black women in the church, I think about the church being a place of solace, a place of hope and refuge. There are so many things that go on in the home, and the church has always been that place where women could go to and just come together. I think of back in the slavery times in which Black women gathered to worship communally, and they worshiped God who gave them freedom and liberation and gave them that sense of salvation and power of Christ. And that's always been such a very important piece of women in the church.
I kind of think it's important also to mention that Black women in the church are a very important part of the civil rights movement. I feel like have been and continue to be the silent sort of backbone of that civil rights movement, of doing justice and seeking peace and mercy and forgiveness and kindness and love and service, which are all themes that come through the church.
So true. That is so true. We could go on and on about this, and it's just wonderful that we represent so much of the church. And before we move forward, I just want to say thank you, Paula, for just all in what you've done for women's ministry and as we put on this program. And I just want all of you to know that before we hear our guest presentation, which will be of Catherine Garner, and she will be interviewed by our very own pastor, Pastor Reginald Richardson, you will hear this beautiful song by Paula Rogers and Sandra Nita Hall. So we are looking forward to being blessed in song by the two of you. And after their song, we will then hear from Catherine Garner and Pastor Richardson.
My blessed Redeemer, I think of him all the day long. I sing, for I cannot his child, and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb.
Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, his child, and forever I am.
His child, and forever I am. His child, and forever I am.
Matter Wednesdays, and Terry and Paula have introduced, and we're rolling into our third segment. And so when we talked earlier, right? So I asked you to speak about Black women in the church and the importance of Black women just in faith and Christianity, people who have walked with God. I wanted to ask you about some research you did. So you told me about this person in the Bible that you ended up doing kind of research on and learning a lot about. Who was that person? And share with the audience who that person was and what about it.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our talk. So the person I've chosen for my subject, and after looking through, because there were several that I had in mind, but the one who stuck out foremost in my mind, first and foremost, was Hannah, and that would be the mother of Samuel. She stuck out in my mind because of her level of faith and commitment to God through adversity, through torment, through whatever she was dealing with. And she didn't tell anybody else. She just told God. She told God, and God rewarded her faith. So this is the reasons I chose Hannah. And the more I studied into her character, the more I began to understand why this person just stood out in my mind. Because in my own walk, I find in my studies that having a certain level of faith and commitment and trust and belief is key to your walk in this world. With all the adversity and everything around us, it's key to having a safe walk. Didn't say necessarily it would be a joyful one, but it is joyful because Jesus is walking with you.
So, Catherine, when we look at the story of Hannah, we know that she's biblically based. She comes out of the Bible. So, like, what resources, what type of scriptures, where can we look to learn about the story of Hannah?
Well, I chose to use the Bible. 1 Samuel chapters 1 and chapter 2. And in 1 Samuel chapter 2, it's verses 1 through 11. And I also chose the book Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 55. And chapter 55 is specifically entitled The Child Samuel. And it gives a deeper insight into Hannah's character.
So when we're looking at Hannah's character, or the character of Hannah, what stood out most to you? Like, what was the thing that said, what drew you to Hannah? Like, what was the thing that stood out? She was a mother. We know she was a mother. She know that, she was a upstanding woman. But what was the thing? What was her drive? What drove her to be who she is and a Bible hero?
Well, for me, again, I can't reinstate this enough, is her level of faith and commitment to God, her trust, absolute trust in God, and her belief that God was going to get her through the torment she was dealing with. And I'll give you a little bit of background. She was married to a man named Elkanah. Elkanah was a Levite. He was very devout. Hannah was also very devout, a very fervent and pious woman. She was very spiritual. She wanted very badly to have children. And if you know, in the Hebrew economy, children, sons, to carry on the lineage was really important. So to be barren was for a woman to feel like she was cursed. She wanted to have this child or children, and this became a source of mental anguish for her. But what drove it even deeper, in a deeper problem of anguish for her, was that her husband decided to go against what he knew that God did not permit as a committed man of God. He decided to marry a second wife because he wanted those children. He couldn't wait. So the second wife's name was Peninnah. Let me get that right. Peninnah. She was described as jealous and narrow-minded. She was prideful and insolent. Now, by doing this and taking a second wife, Elkanah actually showed a lack of faith in God. He brought some problems into his household by doing this. Even though Peninnah bore him children, the problem was, because of her character, she tormented the first wife, which was Hannah. And this became a deeper source of misery for Hannah. It took away the peace from the home. It broke the sacredness of the marriage between the man and the woman. It brought added distress because those children were not hers, and it put her in a place of, again, mental anguish, because this woman, Peninnah, tormented her with the fact that she couldn't bear children and made her feel less than, though she were cursed. That was a problem. One of the things with Peninnah being mean to Hannah because she couldn't bear children, it caused a lot of distress for Hannah. But this is the encouragement that I got out of this regarding Hannah. Even though she was sorely distressed and her hope seemed crushed, one of the characteristics that stood out starkly about Hannah is how she met this trial. She met this trial as what was described as uncomplaining meekness. What is that? Uncomplaining meekness. She showed meekness, which is strength. The world thinks of meekness as weakness, but Moses was described as the meekest man that ever lived, but he was very strong in character. So it's the opposite of what we see or hear in the world about meekness. It wasn't weakness at all. It showed great strength. And uncomplaining meekness not only showed great strength, but it showed a level of a high character, a level of commitment. And Hannah didn't murmur, is what I'm trying to say. She didn't murmur or complain about her lot, even though it caused her deep anguish. She took that to God. And that was also one of the things that was amazing to me, because of the fact she couldn't bear children or heirs to carry on the lineage of her husband. She remained faithful and committed to God and to her marriage. And although she was grieved in her heart and wept without restraint, she cast her plight upon God and told no one else, not even her husband. That really stood out to me, that she held that in and didn't complain to anyone. So no one knew what she was really dealing with. She did not even reproach Peninnah for her torment of her. Hannah was made to feel that she was cursed of God because of her barren state. Every year the family would go up to Shiloh because Elkanah, being a priest, he would go up and offer sacrifices for himself or his family, and consecrated themselves to God. And one of the things that happened when Hannah went up to Shiloh, she went into the temple. She consecrated herself to God. She was so fervent in her prayers that Eli the priest noticed her lips moving but he didn't hear any sound coming out. And she was fervently praying to God. So Eli and his the lady was drunk, and he went to rebuke her. She let him know she was pouring out her heart to God, and she didn't even give Eli the priest the details of her anguish. But she let him know that she was pouring out to God her prayer in private. So Eli noticed and was touched by her. He was touched by her fervent prayer and her dedication and her love for God. It came through. It just emanated. So he pronounced upon her a blessing instead of reprimand. So when I permitted to God, faith that she had a son, she was pleading with God for a son. She, with God, about had a son, she would dedicate that son to God. She would dedicate that son to God's service in the temple for the length of his days. Now, I've read about Hannah. It didn't say she had any other children. This was her only child, her only son, according to the Bible and what I read. She did have that son. God blessed her with that son. She dedicated him to the temple service. Every day she went and she made a robe to take him to operate in service. And it was a beautiful thing that she remained faithful to God, kept her commitment to God. Being that that was her only son, she sacrificed that son to God's service. And it was just amazing that her fervent prayer being answered, she kept her commitment to God and honored God and prayed for her son fervently that he would be a blessing in service of God and a blessing to others.
Catherine, I have,
Yes.
can you hear me? So I know there's some,
Yes.
a lot of women probably would feel, I know when pastors get talking and we talk about, God can bless and all the things that God's able to do, sometimes pastors, and especially it being, unfortunately, primarily, when it comes to the concept of ordination and other things like that, men are the only ones that are able or, currently, right? Hannah was a woman of faith and strong conviction, as you shared with us. How can this apply to our sisters in the church who may feel that it's not an open opportunity? Even Eli, the prophet, right? The prophet comes in and he starts judging. The priest comes in and starts judging her. And because he didn't understand what she was going through. How can we be more, as a church, be more understanding to women who are coming and being earnest to God and make sure we're not coming from a place of judgment, but a place of understanding? What advice would you give to the church?
Well, some of these details about Hannah were very interesting to me, and it touched my heart. And it shows how, as a mother, a devoted woman of God, she devoted her time to prepare her child for God's service. We have devoted women of God who don't have children in the church, but they take on other people's children to help give encouragement and that kind of thing to other people's children. Or we could have children in the church that don't have parental help for some reason. There are adoptees, there are foster children, all of the mothers in the church, or if you take it upon yourself to mother, even though you don't have biological children. And I could think of a woman in our church that does that, to nurture and to give encouragement and solid counsel, godly counsel, spiritual counsel as needed. Women in the church have been the backbone of the church. And when you look at women of color in the Bible, when you look at women of color in our church, they have been, and all down through slavery and down through a lot of the plight, huge plight that has affected us today, when as parents, whether they be young or middle aged, can take a role of commitment and faithfulness to God, and to seek out younger sisters in the church that they can nurture and counsel and give godly counsel to, and be an example of godly women. And that is so very needed in the church. One thing with Hannah, can you imagine giving up your only child? We have the examples in the Bible. Now, this child, she prayed, and this is one of the things that I read. Hannah prayed for years. It didn't say how many years, but she prayed for years for that child to be born, to be blessed, that her womb would be blessed. Years. And that to me stood out as a strong level of commitment, a powerful devotion to God. Can you imagine, like I asked before, giving up your only child that you prayed for years to give to God's service? In all your anguish, to give up to God's service.
I couldn't imagine, Catherine. That would be very, very challenging. But what would be the thing that, like, I know you mentioned that her sacrifice, her willingness to serve, all these things. As we get ready to close, what would be the biggest thing that stood out? Like, what was how did Hannah's story impact you, and how should it impact the women of our church?
That we live to serve, and our children should be dedicated to God for his service, and taking your further to the real issue, the reality that Jesus came to this world. God gave his only begotten son to die a cruel death on a tree that he created, that was fashioned by the enemy into an instrument of torture, so that he could die to save a world that would be lost in sin. So that to me is a powerful impact, to save us from the horrors of the darkness of this world, so that we could live to be a blessing to others. That to me is, I'm going to get emotional, but that to me is a powerful, powerful example. So Hannah's example of sacrificing her own son, and then when you think back to Isaac and Abraham, you think back to people who chose to live a life of service. I think that is a powerful example for us to look at. In his life. Another important aspect is the prophetic prayer that she prayed, that also told of King David and Jesus in that prophecy of her prayer. And you can read her prayer in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. So her loving sacrifice, dedication, and commitment to God is a witness down through the ages of the role of a godly mother, or the role of a strong woman in the church that can nurture and admonish and give godly counsel to other sisters in the church. So I hope we've all been blessed by the brief retelling of the story of this humble woman named Hannah, this humble woman of God.
Catherine, thank you so much for reminding us the story of Hannah and the importance of being faithful, even though you may face some hardship. I know this has been an amazing time. And Catherine, you are just a wealth of information, and we're so glad that we ever have this chat with you. And I know I've learned a lot. So we'll turn it back over to Terry and Paula back at the church or the studio.
Wow, that was so informative and engaging. Thank you so much, Catherine. And also a special thank you to our pastor, Reginald Richardson. And just want to remind you that we are going into our last week of Black Women Matter Wednesdays. Next week is our last week. Invite someone and come along with us. Also want to remind you about, you should see it somewhere around here, over here, all of our social media outlets. Find us on Twitter. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us at our website. You can also find us on Facebook. And we just want to invite you to join us in any way that you feel comfortable. Thank you. Take care until next week.